Thank you very much all for coming, colleagues, students, and friends. This book was launched in December in Muscat, Oman, at Beit al-Zubair Museum. And the pictures you saw on the screen were from that event when you walked in. Oman was the ancestral home of Sheikh-Sir Mbarak al-Hinawy, who is the central figure of my book. And Oman is also the present-day home of most of his surviving 14 children and their families. Hence, it was fitting to have the first launch in Oman, where the story of Sheikh Mbarak began and continues into the present day. Indeed, the book launch in Oman brought together different generations of the al-Hinawy family, including the book's main patron, Sheikh Mbarak's son, Sayyid Khalifa al-Hinawy, and Sheikh Mbarak's daughter Fathia, who first invited me to work on this biography of Sheikh Mbarak, her father, in 1999, when I was a doctoral student at the University of Oxford. So it's a long time in gestation. My research on Sheikh Mbarak appeared initially as a life sketch in my doctoral dissertation, which examined how Swahili-speaking Muslim communities living around the Western Indian Ocean littoral constructed, articulated, and enacted their understandings of home and belonging over multiple generations. And at that time, my anthropological concerns centered on the extent to which human social bonds are configured by space and relatedness, and the role that changing socio-political conditions play in such formations. And my ethnographic case study on this theoretical subject was the al-Hinawy family that comprises several dozen contemporary members and hundreds of ancestors who have resided in various locations around the Western Indian Ocean, including the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, most of whom trace their history back to at least the 7th century CE. For them, Sheikh Mbarak's life history is but a recent episode in this long and complex narrative. His story takes place between the 19th and 20th centuries and was regularly punctuated by his movements between various locations in East Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The book draws on oral history collected during several field-based research trips to Mombasa and Muscat, and archival material located on 4 continents: Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. Most particularly, the book draws upon Sheikh Mbarak's personal library, his papers and diaries from 1924 to 1959, written in English, Arabic, and Kiswahili. And this archive includes material that spans more than 60 years. It's a unique archive of materials, and it's currently housed in Muscat in Oman. Now, ironically, at the time of my doctoral research, the al-Hinawy family did not know of the existence of this archive. It was, in fact, the year I was appointed to York in 2005 that this archive came to light, and I was then invited to Oman to begin research on it. After almost 8 weeks of wading through crumbling, pyrethrum-dusted pages of ephemera such as invitation cards, onion skin memos, telegrams, worm-eaten photographs, and a potpourri of other colportage, a rather unexpected portrait of this man began to take shape. Here was a man who I'd ostensibly stereotyped as a cardboard cutout of a privileged member of the Arab elite society of East Africa, this rather out-of-the-way place, acting, behaving, and conversing with me now in ways that I had not imagined, and I continue to be perplexed by. To put it differently, as I worked through the family archive and correlated and juxtaposed these materials alongside records and images in other locations, the life sketch I had initially drawn up of Sheikh Mbarak became a more fully fledged biography that challenges some of the scholarly histories of such individuals and their communities in East Africa during the imperial age. Such histories, often presented through the lenses of Europe, the European imperial project, or marginalization of black African populations owing to slavery and then the asymmetry of colonization, have in fact left little room for the histories of communities that do not easily fit into these grand narratives. So, what Between Empires attempts to do is tell the story of this man whose life and career were lived out amidst constant social and political change from the end of the 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, and at the thresholds of 2 imperial powers, the Sultanate of Zanzibar on the one hand, and the British Empire on the other. And all of this took place in a complex socio-cultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic space, the city of Mombasa. It is thus a book, I hope, that talks about a man and his context in which he lived at an historical moment when so many things seemed possible. In writing this book, I was forced to confront many of my own assumptions and learning. I had to rethink the processes that informed the social formation of coastal communities of East Africa before the advent of the nation state, particularly the role of Arab communities in East Africa after the abolition of slavery. I began to get a more nuanced sense of what it meant to be a local administrator in a colonial context. But more than anything, writing this book challenged my understanding of what it means to actually sit down and write a history from below, or a microhistory. Since my time at Cambridge University, when I undertook a master's degree in Islamic history, I have been influenced by social historians such as Carlo Ginzburg and Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. In writing this biography, I have regularly asked myself, to what extent was Sheikh Mbarak a figure akin to Ginzburg's Menocchio or Ladurie's Platter family? Given that we have so few histories of these communities that draw on their own recollections and materials, I've asked, can Sheikh Mbarak be described as a subaltern, a mason of empire that became increasingly anonymous and voiceless to the age of black African nationalism, but through whose very presence and difference gave clearer definition to this form of nationalism on the African continent? Some of these critical reflections underpin this biography and continue to animate my thinking, and I'm happy to return to some of these reflections in the discussion. But let me now briefly sketch out Sheikh Mbarak's story for you and show you some of the images that are contained within this illustrated book. Sheikh Mbarak bin Ali bin Saeed bin Ali bin Mansur al-Hinawy was born into a family whose ancestors originated in Oman. Members of his family migrated to East Africa when the Oman Sultan, Saeed bin Sultan, re-established Omani suzerainty along the Western Indian Ocean. And it was Majid bin Saeed, shown in this beautiful, rare tinted photograph from the Royal Geographic Society in London, who became the first Sultan of Zanzibar. It is likely that Sheikh Mbarak's grandfather migrated from Zanzibar to Mombasa in the late 1800s. By the end of the 19th century, the Isles of Zanzibar and the 10-mile coastal strip of East Africa, with Mombasa as its capital, became British protectorates. The British, at least initially, worked closely with the Sultan of Zanzibar's appointed administrators to govern the coastal protectorate, then known as the province of Sayyidiyeh. Men like Sir Ali bin Salim al-Busaidi, a kinsman of the Sultan and the first Liwali, or governor of the coast, shown here in all his regalia in a beautiful portrait in the al-Hinawy archive, this one here, won over some of the British administrators with their erudition and work ethic. Together, the British and the Sultan's appointees began to transform Mombasa from a seasonal dhow harbor into a vibrant, cosmopolitan port city. Mbarak al-Hinawy was born into this fast-changing world, a world not unlike our own that was changing both in terms of technology and values. Imagine, for instance, that Mbarak's birth on the 2nd of November 1896 was not recorded in a hospital or registered in a ministry or on an iPad, but was handwritten by a local katib. Imagine that, handwriting. Who was a Quran teacher, and he wrote this in Arabic on this small piece of paper that's there. Okay, it's not the actual size of it. And Sheikh Mbarak kept this document all his life as proof of his birth date. Mbarak also kept his school report cards, including this one, which dates from October 1st, 1914, right here. And this is from the headmaster of the Arab school in Mombasa. He also kept the letters and city ordinances that British authorities sent to his mother that asked that she clean and repair her property, which was in the heart of Old Town Mombasa. It was through such documents that I was able to gain insight into Mbarak's life and times and his personality, including the leadership qualities he appears to have displayed from quite a young age. Now, this may stem from the fact that he had lost his father very early and had to care for his mother and perhaps even his extended family over a period of time. Now, whatever his motivation, from the start it was evident that he was no ordinary boy. He seemed to be someone who was not averse to going against the accepted social norms and practices. He was amongst the few local Arabs to be schooled in the Christian mission school, and then an Arab school that did not teach religious education or even the Quran. He was also amongst the few Arabs in Mombasa to enlist in the army during the First World War. Now, and this charming picture on the right-hand side of the screen shows him in his khaki private's uniform, complete with a pillbox cap. Okay, and there you can't see, but there's an Arabic numeral 3 identifying him as one of the members of the 3rd King's African Rifles, the regiment to which he was assigned. Such documents and period photographs also provided me with insights into changes that were taking place in Mombasa. For example, the ordinances that were received by the young Mbarak's mother, which I mentioned earlier, revealed the grip that the British gained on the city in the name of disease prevention and cleanliness since their arrival in the 1800s. And pictures with Europeans being carried on trolley cars that were pushed by local porters provides a picture of how colonial society operated with all its quirks and disturbing contradictions. After the end of the war, British East Africa, with Mombasa as its main port, developed quickly. Through the work of large numbers of labor gangs from India and indigenous communities, the British had already completed the railroad into the interior, which was popularly known as the Lunatic Express. And through the course of the war, they had begun to build up Mombasa's Kilindini Harbor so it could support both military and civilian passenger ships. And that's this picture over here. After being decommissioned from the army, the young Mbarak al-Hinawy served in the British colonial administration as Arab assistant to the Land Arbitration Board. Clearly, land rights were a big issue during the British period. First of all, due to the post-abolition society in which land grabbing was the norm, as well as the appropriation of indigenous lands from, for example, communities like the Kikuyu or Luo or Digo, who were local communities based in Mombasa and its environs. Sheikh Mbarak soon left his job, and almost without warning, on the 1st of August 1927, he boarded a ship called the SS Azela Rideau, a passenger ship bound for Egypt. His arrival in Cairo was announced with fanfare in the local newspapers. The Egyptian papers hailed him as an old and great friend of the Hizb al-Wafd party, which was headed then by Saad Zaghloul Pasha, the first president of Egypt, a man who had fought against the British for Egypt's independence. Now, how might you say is this man, a young man based in Mombasa, connected to this very important Egyptian freedom fighter or nationalist? Well, it seems that young Mbarak had met Saad Zaghloul and the members of his nationalist party, the Hizb al-Wafd, some years prior when they were returning to Egypt from the Seychelles Islands, where they had been exiled for having incited uprisings against the British. They happened, quite by chance, to stop in Mombasa on this journey home. And it was the young Mbarak who had helped them find food and lodging and a tailor who produced new suits for them, as their clothing had been completely worn down during their exile. Now, the leaders of Saad Zaghloul's party never forgot Mbarak and his hospitality and became his lifelong friends. Indeed, when Sheikh Mbarak's eldest son, Farid, who is shown here on the right-hand side of the screen, when he went to Victoria College, he was a ward of the key member of the Wafd party. Farid went on to become a diplomat for Kenya and served under Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, and then after retiring and repatriating to Oman, he became an ambassador for Oman and was posted to Egypt, Washington, and China. It's an interesting legacy and a kind of a nested story within this broader history of Sheikh Mbarak. After Mbarak returned to Mombasa from Egypt, he married Sada al-Harasi, who was from a prominent family in Lamu. The couple went on to have 14 children, 7 of whom are shown in this family picture on the left. You will not find it odd here if I remark that one of his children's names begin with the letter F, except for one, Khalifa, who was named after Sultan Khalifa bin Harub al-Busaidi, the 9th and longest reigning Sultan of Zanzibar, under whom Sheikh Mbarak served during his career as Liwali of Mombasa and then Liwali for the coast. The term Liwali, of course, if I remind you, means governor. And Sheikh Sultan Khalifa bin Harub al-Busaidi is shown here at the bottom of this screen sitting at his desk in Zanzibar. And this is a letter from the Sultan to Sheikh Mbarak, congratulating on the birth of his son and for naming him after his own first name, Khalifa. Now, during his time as Liwali of Mombasa, Sheikh Mbarak was responsible for the Arab and Swahili communities of the 10-mile coastal strip of East Africa. He also worked closely with the British to continue to modernize Mombasa. He was involved in a number of local civic associations and boards. He was particularly focused on developing Mombasa's infrastructure and, quite ironically, its sanitation department to accommodate Mombasa's growing and increasingly cosmopolitan population. You'll remember that it was his mother who received notices from the city ordinances asking her to clean up her act, and now it was Sheikh Mbarak who was sending probably notices to others. Sheikh Mbarak was also keenly engaged in the study of Swahili language at this time. He was chief examiner for Swahili, a job that frequently took him to the Kenya colony's capital at Nairobi. He also became a researcher and editor for a number of European Swahili scholars based in England and other parts of Europe, including Alice Werner, an important British missionary scholar who was the first chair of African languages at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the United Kingdom. Werner and Sheikh Mbarak shared a fascinating 5-year-long written correspondence. I've referred to it as a kind of intellectual love affair, in which he reveals the extent to which they both were assisting each other and other scholars on the nuances of Swahili literature in terms of grammar, vocabulary, and historical references, amongst other matters. Sheikh Mbarak is recognized as being instrumental in preserving, translating, and editing precious early Swahili language manuscripts, many of which were at the time written in Arabic script. And one of the key works he published was the Al-Aqida and Fort Jesus Mombasa, which is being republished this year in Kenya. At the start of the Second World War, Sheikh Mbarak enlisted as a second lieutenant in the Indian and Arab Army, and within a few months he was pardoned from service to assist the government with local communities to prepare them for the hostilities. Mombasa served as a key naval base during the war and was the place where Japanese codes were deciphered in tandem with the codes deciphered at Bletchley Park in England. The British investment in protecting Mombasa was high. It was the main terminus of the railway and furnished supply routes into northeastern Africa. And as this poster shows, it's produced by the Empire Marketing Board, the one with the lion in the center, it showed that the British continued to think of this area as nature's zoo under their, of course, watchful eye, or the eye of the imperial lion. In 1941, Sheikh Mbarak was appointed governor for the coast. He was only the second person in Mombasa's history to hold this important and prestigious post. He was responsible for the training and work of the Arab administration of the coast, and also had to work closely with local Islamic judges as well as with the British administrators and governors. His responsibilities were quite wide. He was also required to travel to the UK to provide testimonials on Mombasa and the coast to the Colonial Office. This was the moment post-Second World War when Britain was beginning to feel that they needed to figure out a way to address some of the issues that were going on in terms of people who were clamoring for a national state and decolonization. And Sheikh Mbarak was desperately fighting for the rights of his community to have a say at the table. Indeed, he traveled in 1949 to the UK as a delegate to the All Africa Conference. In the post-war period, Britain was beginning to see increasing unrest in its colonies. India had been granted independence in August 1947, and other colonies were now agitating for theirs. Britain's All-Africa Conference aimed to keep African colonies in its grip, but this effort was to be unsuccessful. In the Kenya colony, local communities were already staging armed rebellions against the European settlers who had appropriated large tracts of ancestral lands. You'll recall I mentioned that they had already begun this process in the early 1800s, and they continued to do so. And in the Kenya colony, this was very, very, very problematic. And it sparked vicious armed crackdowns on legitimate protesters as well as those that were labeled terrorists, saying that this term is not new. Okay? And it was particularly vehement against the leaders of legitimate protesters like Jomo Kenyatta, who I mentioned became Kenya's first prime minister. And those of you who have been following what's happening in Kenya will know, or the scholarship, one of the most important books that was published in this last 10 years was David Anderson's The Histories of the Hanged, which talks about the issues of this kind of land grabbing, which resulted in white settler uprisings against white settlers in the Kenya highlands, and the terrible repercussions on many legitimate protests that were going on, and the kind of fear that was propelled by groups such as that were labeled the Mau Mau. Now, a critical moment that signaled this change occurred in 1947 during the Mombasa General Strike, in which 15,000 laborers, including dock workers, railway workers, houseboys, sugar workers, and other trades, staged a general strike that paralyzed Mombasa for 12 days. And in fact, the anti-colonial sentiments that were going on in the Kenya colony soon spread to the coast. And during this period, Sheikh Mbarak focused attention on the question of the political role of the Arab and Swahili communities and Muslims could play in the future nation state. In this effort, he desperately tried to convince the British of their obligation to these communities and the legitimacy of their claims. After all, the protectorate that was established in the 1800s was legally accepted by the British, but when it came to discussions about who would then control the coast, all of a sudden they had forgotten that this agreement had been signed, and some British administrators simply called it a legal formality. Obviously, there have been differing views about this historical event, and so this became a big point of contention. Sheikh Mbarak involved himself in a number of activities at this time, including the East African Muslim Community, East African Muslim Welfare Society, as well as the Mombasa Institute of Muslim Education. He also paid particular attention to the Omani Arabs through his establishment of the Omani Arab Association that could support dhow captains and sailors from Oman to have proper accommodation during their seasonal migrations to Mombasa. I was really surprised to find this in the documentation because it had been told to me that, of course, this trade had waned so badly. But what we see, in fact, in this picture on the right-hand side of the screen is a fantastic seasonal migration. This picture is actually from the early 1950s, showing the number of dhow captains who were continuing to operate despite the advent of new technology in naval craft. And the descriptions of the conditions in which they were suffering in the city reflect a kind of issue about how they were treated when they arrived. And Sheikh Mbarak set up the society to establish a kind of a better living conditions as they were there as temporary workers or migrants or people who needed a place to stay while they were stocking their boats. It also suggests that trade between the East African coast and Oman was actually quite a vibrant thing. It wasn't something that had all of a sudden disappeared in the colonial era. It was something that continued on, and it's one of those things that is sort of not really discussed and not really talked about in much of the scholarly literature. It's almost like with the advent of the British, the trade declined, and these people didn't exist anymore. But what these organizations and civic associations that Sheikh Mbarak was part of were part of a broader civic set of associations that seem to have proliferated in Mombasa. And they suggest an increasing pluralistic kind of environment in which there was kind of a set of associations, civic groups, etc. And of course the rise of political parties, which had not existed quite in the same way and to the same extent in the past. Now, for his various services to the British and to the Sultanate of Zanzibar and many other communities, Sheikh Mbarak was decorated with a number of medals and honors, including a knighthood, the Brilliant Star of Zanzibar, the Commandeur de l'Étoile de la Grande Camorre, through the French government. But I've developed in the book that my thesis is that Sheikh Mbarak, while obviously honored by these decorations, was primarily focused on the work, in his work on the future of Arab and Swahili communities on the coast and Muslims generally. In the latter part of his life, he continued to appeal to the British for a say at the table of government, but unfortunately, he seems to have been met with increasingly deaf ears. The British seem to be bent on the argument of quote-unquote native rule. And it did not include the multiple non-European, non-indigenous settler communities of East Africa, such as the Asians and the Arabs, who had in fact lived on this continent and in this part of the world for several centuries, and did not consider themselves anything but locals of Mombasa or people who were people of the coast in that broad general sense. They didn't see themselves as indigenous, but they didn't also see themselves as natives. They didn't see themselves as people who would not have a say in government. They saw themselves as part of the overall fabric of society. But the British had already set up a kind of a native, non-native discourse in the early part of the 20th century, and this discourse then led itself to its logical conclusion that it would be the natives, that is black African communities, that would rule in the nation state to follow. However, to the last, Sheikh Mbarak presented a firm statesman-like position in public. He presided, for example, over the visits of Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother, and was also in attendance at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Unfortunately, in the end, the communities which he represented and stood up for so many times suffered great political, economic, and human losses as Kenya and other East African colonies became nation states. Sheikh Mbarak was knighted in the final year of his life in 1959. But he did not live to see the 1964 Zanzibar Revolution, which in fact resulted in the dissolution of the Sultanate of Zanzibar, and thus the amalgamation of the coastal protectorate into the Republic of Kenya, including the city of Mombasa, which is obviously the second largest port, one of the largest ports in Kenya today. So finally, while the new nation initially recognized Sheikh Mubarak's work and efforts by naming a prominent street after him in Mombasa, you can see that at the top of the screen, over time his history has been relegated to the archives and to the fading memories of old postcards and aging generations. It is certainly not part of Kenya's national curriculum. This book, I hope, reopens this chapter in the history of East Africa. It is a period of history that has regularly been popularly portrayed primarily from the perspectives of African nationalism and British imperialism and its critics. Rarely have we had the kind of intimate history of individuals like Sheikh-Sir Mbarak who traverse these political projects, and even rarer are full-blown biographies of Africa's numerous settler communities, including Arabs and Asians. Rarer still are good, well-researched biographies of many of the Western Indian Ocean cities like Mombasa. And this book, I hope, provides others the motivation to explore and write about these histories that can build up as well as trouble the extant corpus of narratives on imperial, colonial, and pre-nation state contexts and societies, and the life histories of individuals like Sheikh Mbarak, both in Africa and elsewhere. On a more contemporary note, I also hope that the book challenges some of the recent and even more sedimented negative stereotypical portraits of Arab and Muslim communities in East Africa and elsewhere. All of these remain long overdue projects. Whatever we might call them, histories from below or above, social histories or microhistories, I believe they need to be written down in order for us to engage with them. Thank you.